Thank you so much, Niels, for a really kind introduction. So I wanted to spend some time to just give you a little bit of an overview of some of the work that we did in what I titled Scalable GPU-based visualization of large volume data. So it's volume data, which is scalar field data, 3D spatial data. Sometimes they could be time dependent, but I will show basically static volume renderings. Um, Before I do that, let me show you what the group currently looks like. So this is what we call the high performance visualization group at KAUST. High performance mainly means using GPUs for fast real-time visualization. So right now we are six students, and so several senior people down here. So it's a relatively small group, but yeah, that's the current group composition. You might also see, actually, I noticed one of your future speakers is Thomas Holt. So he is one of alumni. He did a PhD with me here at KAUST. And Johanna Bayer, she was here as a postdoc for 3 years also in my group at KAUST. So I wanted to talk about large-scale visualization. So sometimes you call what we do scientific visualization, focusing on spatial data. So we really have a strong focus on 3D spatial context. And what does large scale mean? So you could think about like this is I hope you can see my mouse pointer. So this is like a large electron microscopy volume, and that can be easily tera to petabytes, just one static volume of brain tissue scanned with nanometer resolution. Then, of course, you can have unstructured grids. This is a fluid simulation grid here with many cells of some oil reservoir. You could have climate simulations of the Earth, then you would maybe have an unstructured grid over the Earth and many time steps. You could have lots of segmented objects or structures. So that's also a problem in terms of scalability. From simple things like how do you find millions of objects if you have a query, for example, and you say, I'm looking for objects that fulfill some property. And then how do you find these out of a million or many million objects? We also did some work in particle data from material science data sets, for example. Also important are simulations that are ensembles. So for each time steps, you don't have one data set, but you have many data sets for different parameters or different probabilities. So all of these kinds of things can lead to very large data in our context. So these are all examples from our work. So when we say, well, extreme scale, so that the most extreme scale that we have worked on in our group is especially in collaboration with Hans-Peter Pfister's group at Harvard about the connectome. So basically doing large-scale volume visualization for electron microscopy data to ultimately find out how the mammalian brain is wired, how things are connected together, and so on. And even tiny blocks of brain tissue, like 60 microns across, would be already a teravoxel. And then if you have segmentation data, that's multiple terabytes. And of course, it can easily go toward the petabytes. So current data sets that are in connectomics are petabytes in size. So we do I would say, very technical stuff. Also, this talk will be quite technical, I guess, like focusing on data structures and algorithms, which are often really simple challenges, like just addressing data in memory, finding stuff in memory. So first of all, addressing things where it is located in memory. So it's very hard to do scalable visualization without having some multi-resolution approach. So you take the initial data set, like your full resolution electron microscopy scan, and you produce subsequently downsampled lower resolution versions. And then the idea is kind of, if you look at the data set on your screen, you don't have a gigantic amount of pixels, even on very large displays. So your data set is usually much larger than what you can display on screen. So basically, it's about zooming in and out and adapting the actual resolution of data that is fetched for this visualization on the fly with some multi-resolution scheme. But then, of course, you need to find objects. This is sometimes coupled with resolution, but it can also be just finding a set of voxels. How do you find this set of voxels? And what's happening in volume visualization is often that a lot of stuff is done with the same data structure. So usually an octree or some variant of an octree, like the 3D version of a quad tree, hierarchically subdividing space by just hierarchically subdividing into 8 octants and then again octants and so on until you are down at the lowest resolution or the lowest subdivision level. But there's actually a lot of it's very flexible in the sense that it can do many things with the same data structure, but on the other hand, it's also very inflexible because it's doing different things with the same data structure. So what we do a lot of times is we try to decouple these different things. So if you want to have one high-level idea that we are using a lot in our research is basically finding out different tasks, the different technical tasks of for example, finding the correct resolution that you want or finding the correct objects that you want, and then decoupling that into different data structures. So I want to show several ideas to achieve scalability, building on mainly this idea of decoupling stuff. The first one is about virtual memory management, and the second one I will talk about the residency octree that Niels mentioned that might be of most interest to you. But let me first talk about kind of how to find stuff in memory. So we did actually a lot of memory management on GPUs over the years. So 3D memory management, kind of. Of course, there is not really 3D memory, but it's like 3D textures. And in these 3D textures, some subsets, bricks or blocks or chunks of the data are stored. And then if you want to view this really high-res volume here, and this is your viewport, if you zoom into the volume and you want to get successively higher resolutions, usually you have an octree, so shown here on the left, and then you have to traverse this octree. And for really gigantic data at some point, although it scales logarithmically, basically at some point you have to do a lot of traversals. And when you do volume rendering, you shoot rays into the volume, you cast rays, and then you need to traverse them really all the time. So sometimes it can be very beneficial for large data to just have direct access. And direct access here would mean you have a virtual memory hierarchy and you have different resolution levels in this virtual memory, and you just directly go to the resolution that you want to without necessarily traversing such an octree. So one idea would basically to decouple the memory management from this hierarchical traversal and change to what is then a page table hierarchy for virtual memory management. So to show that a little bit, the idea is here, this volume that looks very small, that's supposed to be a gigantic volume. So just for illustration, it's very small here. So you can imagine a terabyte or a petabyte of voxel data. And then basically you do paging, very similar to a CPU, but you do it in 3D with 3D textures and so on. But there's like a page table that reference little blocks or bricks of the volume, let's say 32 cubed voxels. There's a huge trade-off between how big or small should these bricks be, and so on. And then you basically, for large volumes, you realize that even your page table, although it's a huge factor smaller than the original volume, is still too large to fit into something like GPU memory. And so you do another page table, and at some point you're at the top, and then the page table at the top would be called the page directory. So this is very similar to what CPUs do. What is different here is also that you have kind of an orthogonal axis that's like a theoretical axis, not a real spatial axis or anything like this. So now the different columns here are different resolutions. So you basically have a page table hierarchy for every resolution, so every version of a downsampled data set. And then you can basically access every resolution directly, except that you have to traverse this page table hierarchy. But then this page table hierarchy is much smaller than the hierarchy of the octree, for example, and that's where performance improvements come from. And the only thing that's really has to be resident in GPU memory is then all the collections of the high-level page table, which is the page directory, and because it's for different resolution, we call it a multi-resolution page directory. So down here it says virtualized. Basically, that means all of this just exists virtually, and then it's on demand, streamed and paged into cache textures, essentially, that act as a cache, like the pool of memory that is actually physically mapped versus the virtual memory that's like kind of the whole address space of the whole volume. So then, of course, on top of that, you want to do volume visualization. So you view your virtual volume that's really just not filled with data in the beginning. And then you cast a ray. And then, of course, per pixel, you cast at least one ray to generate your final volume rendered image. And then you go from sample to sample along the ray. And at every sample, you want to get the data for visualization. In this case, it's solving the volume rendering integral by sampling the data. But now you have to go to this multi-resolution page directory when every sample can determine which resolution it wants, for example, depending on how big a voxel is projected to the screen, depending on your current viewport or camera. And then from the page directory, you go to the page level cache. And if you're lucky, it's resident in the page level cache. So there is something mapped here. And then you go to the final cache, which has the subset of the data, which is kind of the working set, like in CPU virtual memory, that you can then retrieve from this cache here. Of course, it can also happen that there's a cache miss where you actually find out that the data that you wanted is not resident in the cache, and then you have to create some kind of list or structure. In this case, it's a hash table that reports back from the GPU to the CPU what data was missing, that the CPU can use some loader thread or something, fetch data over the network or from hard disk or something like this. So basically, the renderer renders whatever is there. It goes very quickly through this page hierarchy. and then just tells the CPU what data is missing, and then it will be subsequently paged into this block cache. And then the next rendering frame, it will already have this data, depending on how long it takes to page it in, of course. So this looks like a lot of lookups, but actually, of course, there's a lot of spatial coherence along the array, so that lookup overhead is actually relatively small. And as I said, the hierarchy is much smaller than if you would do an octree. So the theoretical scalability that you can compute, like kind of what our data structure can handle, you can do terabytes with 2 page table levels, like 1 page table and 1 page directory, or even petabytes with 3 levels, like 2 page table levels and 1 page directory level. Of course, in practice, all of this data also needs to be transferred and streamed into the memory. So it's still not so easy to do petabytes, obviously, but at least in theory, it scales to this size. I mean, so the virtual volume size can be petabytes, and then it depends on the actual amount of memory you have for your physical cache texture, how well it really works. So this was also a background for the residency octree. So next I wanted to talk about the residency octree. So the second scalability idea that you could have, which is our most recent paper, I guess, in this direction, is decoupling the space subdivision that's usually done by an octree, and now it will be done by an octree, from the actual multi-resolution volume. So the multi-resolution volume will be done using this page table hierarchy that I showed you, but there will also be a space subdivision for different purposes, and that's decoupled. So basically, it's for different purposes, you have a different thing, and both of these work together. So what I will show you now is basically all from this one paper where we took our previous approaches of paging and different kinds of octree structures and merged them together into a new hybrid approach that is not only a new combination of things, but it's like really a new structure. And hybrid really here means that it combines some kind of octree with some kind of page table to basically take the advantages of each and combine them. So obviously you wouldn't do that if one thing would work perfectly, but there are lots of limitations of approaches that are not hybrid. So you could either take the octree, like I described it a little bit, or you could take a page table hierarchy, but each one of those, of course, has some disadvantages. The octree is really, in terms of this coupling, it's too tight. So it couples the geometric extent without voxels, just like what kind of geometric extent does it have in space. It couples that really tightly to how many voxels you have in the end. So it's basically impossible to say I want to have fine granular culling to just skip stuff that is empty with a fine granularity and also have that not affect the resolution that I choose, these kinds of things. So the whole tree traversal and the whole data structure is really doing two pretty separate things with one data structure. Then you have the page table hierarchy, but of course it's not the perfect solution either because it has some other problems. So it's two cores for what's called empty space skipping. So basically, if you have empty parts of the volume, which often means they're not actually empty, but you have a transfer function or something that selects different objects, and then you deselect stuff, and the stuff that you deselected for the visualization is treated as empty, of course, in the rendering of the visualization. So that's too inefficient to some extent. So it is possible and you can do it, but it's also too inefficient and too coarse-grained. And also what's the problem is if you have this paging hierarchy, of course, like I showed, a lot of stuff is missing sometimes. So if you don't find the resolution that you really wanted, then you could find a fallback resolution, some lower resolution that doesn't, like in Google Maps, basically. So if Google Maps doesn't find the full resolution, it just uses a lower resolution and pages in the fuller resolution while you do that. But also this finding takes some time, and in these page tables, this is not super efficient. So this is actually easier to do with an octree. So we wanted to combine these two. So this is now illustrated here. So on the left, it's kind of showing that the tree structure of the octree, this would show 3 different levels of the tree, has a one-to-one mapping with the resolution levels of your data that you computed from the original data down here. You did the successively low resolution versions up here. And the residency octree basically can completely mix and match. So it can match differently sized regions in space without a specific resolution, and they just fill it with any other available resolution. So basically what you need for this is the octree itself is the space subdivision. And then in every space subdivision or every node of the space subdivision, you need to track which different resolutions that are currently resident in cache cover this spatial extent. So that's relatively easy to do. So we do a bit mask in every level of this octree. And basically this bit mask says for 3 different resolutions, is this resolution available for the corresponding spatial extent, or is it not available because it's not resident in cache? And this simple change has a lot of positive implications. So basically, if you then have this problem of missing resolutions that I said, So there's some bricks that are colored that are supposed to be resident in the cache, and then some bricks are in gray that are actually not resident in the cache. And so if you do a sample here, so you want to imagine this ray again, but now we're looking at as a single sample. If you want to sample this brick of this resolution at that spatial location, the data is resident in the cache. So you can just find it in the brick cache because it is mapped. So that means there is a mapping between the two. But then if you want to go to higher resolution, and in this case, even to a spatial position, different spatial position, but it doesn't matter. So in this case, it's not resident in cache. So then you would say, okay, now do I have to render a whole, or what do I do with this missing data? But if you look up here, for example, the lowest resolution in this example covers the whole volume space. So you could take this resolution to just substitute in for down here. But because you had the page table that was skipping all the octree traversal, it's hard to find. I mean, you can, of course, find it by going up some kind of page table hierarchy again, but then you have to go looking in the page table, which is, again, inefficient. So it's doable, but it's pretty inefficient. So it would be easier to already know what the data is that you can substitute. And so this is also what you can do with this residency octree, because you know exactly at every node for this octree and any mapping to the cache, what could be all the available resolutions that you could use for as a substitute. So what you then have is, let's say, this residency octree like this here, stylized, of course, kind of in 2D with 4 children instead of 8 and so on. And you have these bit masks that are telling basically the renderer which of these resolution levels are available for what spatial extent of octree nodes. And you can just mix and match all of these. So it's really much more flexible. What you can also do here is that you can decouple the number of levels, of course. So you can choose a different number of resolution levels. So these are tiny examples, but let's say you have 3 different resolution levels, but you have 4 tree levels or more. So you can do a finer and finer and finer subdivision of space without necessarily needing to drag all these resolutions around. So this is mainly for empty space skipping. You want to skip empty space at a verifying granularity, but then not brick everything with even smaller blocks. So basically, the smallest feasible brick size that could be used in volume rendering is usually 16 cubed or more than 32 cubed that I was showing. But sometimes you want to skip empty space at a smaller granularity. So this you can do here, and then, for example, you would want to take this sample here, you traverse the tree, so this is supposed to be tree traversal now, and when you're down to the granularity of skipping space or empty space, then you could say, okay, now which resolution do I want to take, or which can I take also, and then you look at this bit mask and it just tells you whatever is in the cache without you having to go look through the cache and all these page table hierarchy structures. It's just more efficient. But we originally really designed this already with multi-channel volumes in mind. So this problem just becomes much bigger if you have multiple channels, and especially if you want to have different resolutions for different channels. So if you have size-shift data, like the ones shown here, and let's say 3 example channels, and you want to have different resolutions for every channel, or even different resolutions for different spatial regions in the same channel, you really want to be able to mix and match all of these very flexibly. And so now you can do this with this residency octree structure. And I just show one example that, so I should say all of this implementation was done by Lukas Herzberger in an internship project. So he did all of this implementation. This data structure is not specifically for the web, but he implemented it in WebGPU, in WebAssembly and the shading language of WebGPU. But it's very well adapted to the requirements of doing volume rendering on the web. Okay, so this diagram that I showed you is actually for a single channel, but then how do you go to multiple channels? Well, you just basically replicate these bit masks in every node. So an important thing here is now that it's still a single octree for all of the channels, because other simple approaches would be if you have 4 channels, you do 4 octrees, and basically you traverse 4 octrees simultaneously, which is kind of 4 times the effort. And so here you just have a single octree, but you would have, for 3 channels, you have 3 bit masks in each node. So that's relatively easy to do and efficient to traverse. And then when you now go down the tree, then you can say, okay, here I take this resolution for channel number 1, and I take that different resolution for channel number 2, and for channel number 3, I take a coarser resolution like the one here, for example. So it's pretty flexible, which is otherwise not doable. I mean, basically you amend the tree by additional information that allows you to quickly mix and match all of these different requirements. So to summarize the whole system a little bit, so this is replicated from before, but to give you an overview of what kind of is involved in the whole thing. So the actual renderer is what we call a mixed resolution multi-volume renderer. So it can mix all the resolution levels, and it does multiple channels. It does that by traversing first this residency octree and using the information that it gets from this octree to access the different channels. And what I didn't show now on the previous slide, just of course these channels again reference the actual brick cache or block cache. Yeah, so this is traversing through the whole volume, accessing different data sets. Just to show some examples that Lucas got in his web GPU implementation. So there's a smaller data set with 29 channels. I think here he's rendering maybe 16 of them with 40 frames per second in the web browser, or a bigger data set with 45 frames per second. So basically, it depends on what you're looking at right now, what the transfer function is. It's not always that the bigger data set is not as fast as the smaller data set. It really depends more on the viewing parameters and what's missing in the cache and what's already resident in the cache. Just a few highlights. So for example, if you do an octree per channel, then if you increase the number of channels, which is the horizontal axis, of course, kind of the traversal time of the octree explodes. I mean, it definitely grows linearly, at least with the number of channels. And so you can mitigate that by having a single octree and storing all the information of multiple channels in a single octree. So to summarize this part, which is the biggest part of the talk, so it's basically a hybrid, a combination of more or less standard octrees, but amended with additional information and page tables for the actual data access. So unlike usual, where the octree is also doing the data access, here the data access is not done using the octree, but completely done using the page table. But the octree tells the visualization code, the renderer, which page tables it actually can access and which are available. And has much better scalability to multiple channels. What we didn't really do so far is also this information that's stored in this residency octree would give a lot of opportunities for fine-tune prefetching algorithms. So basically determining like what data would you want to page in with lower resolution, although you currently want to have higher resolution, and then these kind of things. So that would be one thing to obviously focus on in the future, for example. Let me show you some related but different approach. So I mean, you will notice in all of this is kind of the decoupling that I said, but also a lot of what I'm showing is kind of some hybrid idea. So to decouple and then do a hybrid between different data structures and do basically one algorithm that traverses all of these data structures. So there is most volume rendering is nowadays done using raycasting. So volume visualization started with raycasting or ray tracing. At some point, GPUs came in, and then on GPUs, you couldn't do raycasting or ray tracing really in the beginning. So all volume rendering had to switch to rasterization. And then newer GPUs, you could switch back to doing everything with raycasting. So nowadays, most volume rendering is done definitely with some variant of raycasting. But then GPUs still have a lot of rasterization power. All of these rasterization units are there. They could be used at the same time as this raycasting is computed. And there's actually a lot of benefit sometimes, at least in some scenarios, when you combine the two. Sometimes I also have to say hybrid approaches are more work, of course, to implement because you have to do multiple things and then make them work together. But there's a lot of benefits that can potentially be had. So what the idea is here is that we focused on really fine-grained data. So if you have this connectomics data set of exons and dendrites and so on, they're usually rather thin, and they subdivide space into empty, non-empty, empty, non-empty, very, very fragmented regions. And then when you do a query, so on the left side and the right side is the same data set, but a different query on the same data set. So this says, give me all the exons and dendrites, for example, and this says, give me just a subset of all the exons connected to this one red dendrite or something like this. So it very quickly changes which space is classified as being empty or not. And then you have these really tiny structures. And these tiny structures are actually hard to skip efficiently. So if you do an octree, it leads to a lot of fragmentation of this octree subdivision, which I'll show. And so here, this is just illustrating the performance improvements that you could get. So this is basically the standard octree approach, and bright pixels have more accesses to actually skip empty space, and darker pixels have fewer accesses to skip empty space. So this is our approach that does a hybrid between rasterization and raycasting, and this is the standard approach that only does raycasting. Also, I can say maybe sometimes these algorithms only become possible with some GPU features. So this this algorithm that we did here, that I will explain a little bit on the next slides, it would be possible to do on any GPU, but it would be far too slow. So there would really not be a reason to even design such an algorithm. But then GPUs have a feature that is for order independent transparency usually. So basically getting transparent objects sorted in the correct order without doing it completely by sorting really everything. And so you can exploit that also for other things. So this one GPU feature basically made one algorithm possible that was not really possible, feasible, or in any way useful before. So how does this work? Let me show that a little bit in an illustration. So the problem is kind of that empty space keeping is a performance enhancement, but the problem is, of course, it has some overhead. And sometimes this overhead can be bigger than the performance improvement that you gain. So you could actually just say, well, I render the whole thing, and if it's too complicated to figure out what's empty, it's just faster. But usually you don't do that, so you do an octree, and then you subdivide things. And so these red dots here, they show not samples in the volume as before, but they show accesses to the empty space keeping data structure, which in this case are octree boundaries, so the octree nodes with the boundaries of the nodes. And you can see, well, there's just two tiny parts here that are non-empty, but you see a lot of red dots. So there's a lot of overhead just traversing this fragmented part of the volume step by step. It's fully correct, but it's just doing a lot of accesses. So we did this rasterization to substitute this part of the octree by rasterization instead of recasting. And so now there are a lot fewer red dots. Basically, by using the rasterization units of the GPU, that does one thing that it really does very well. And then, of course, the actual volume rendering is still done using raycasting. So there's also an octree here. This is actually an older paper than the residency octree paper. So there we call this octree an occupancy histogram tree because now it's more tracking the occupancy of regions, like different ways of having empty, non-empty regions. It also has like a virtual memory feature that says unknown, which says I didn't look at the data yet. I still have to look at it if it's supposed to be empty or non-empty, and these kind of things. So just to give a little bit of a better example of the space fragmentation, so this would be the octree, again illustrated in 2D as a quad tree, and this would be kind of the space subdivision that you get from our rasterization approach with this occupancy octree. Here's a real rendering. So this is like a snake egg with the skeleton of the snake inside. And then when you do an octree, so this color coding or the brightness coding is again, very bright means very slow. So there's a lot of excesses. I mean, it's just brightness coding for each pixel, how many excesses there are. And then when you do that with our approach, which we call sparse leap for leapings over sparsely fragmented empty, non-empty space, very sparsely populated regions of space. And so here you see it's a lot less bright. So it is really a lot fewer excesses. I also have to say fewer excesses are much faster, but it's not the number of excesses is not directly the performance. So there's also, of course, some overhead involved, but it does get much faster. So this kind of, I mean, we actually did not combine this with the residency octree yet, but it could be combined. I mean, so this occupancy octree and the residency octree, which we had in two different papers, they could just be merged into one octree, and it stores both kinds of information, the memory residence information and this kind of empty space keeping information in addition. Okay, so that was the main part of the talk. Let me wrap up by showing two more things. So basically what you saw was focusing on kind of getting the rendering faster while accessing large data in an efficient way and having data streaming and paging and so on. But you also, I mean, you cannot always look at all of the objects if you have millions of objects to find stuff. So what we did in several papers a bit later, but before the residency octree actually, is to try to employ probabilistic data structures, such as probabilistic hash tables, basically with the idea that if it's too slow to get a deterministic result, like can I skip this empty space or not, you could try to do a probabilistic result with the main idea to have only false positives, but no false negatives. So basically you don't want to skip a space that is actually not empty, but you can avoid skipping some space that actually turns out to be empty. So in the end, it's first the probabilistic data structure, and then of course basically the mistakes that the probability did has to be fixed up with a deterministic path. But if you combine the two, most of the workload is in the probabilistic stage, and then everything else that's fixed up is much faster because the probabilistic stage already reduced everything to a much more manageable size. So I can just briefly mention two things. I don't want to go into too much details, But the first one is basically using a probabilistic set representation, so basically a set of objects. And here in this case, what we did is, again, from connectomics, segmented objects. So basically for every voxel in a terabyte or petabyte sized volume, so in this case, it's for our application, it was terabyte sized. You know an integer label ID to what object this is supposed to belong. So let's say exon number 5, dendrite number 6, exon number 7, and so on. And so you need to store an integer label per voxel. And of course, if you need to store millions of objects, so here this data set has roughly 17 million of segmented objects, you need to first store large enough integers that you can represent these numbers. You need to store that for every voxel, and then you have to go find stuff. And you don't want to traverse like a gigantic list of which voxels do actually belong to what region of space and so on. So on the right-hand side, you see kind of color coding. So each color is a different object. And so how do you find out for specific different regions which objects are contained there? So it's basically in the end, you need a set representation that has this set of contained objects, and then you need to query the objects that you want to find with this set representation if the objects you're trying to find are contained in this set, in that spatial region. So of course that can be done deterministically, but then can be very slow. So you can also do it probabilistically. One thing that I want to skip over, but that's good to mention, is there's basically in this multi-resolution rendering, there's always a problem with if you do culling or finding things. So culling would mean throwing things away out of the rendering. Do you do that with downsampled data or not downsampled data? So for different tasks, you need different things. So in the end, your data structure needs to support both somehow. But if you don't do the downsampling of these label IDs, so for example, you can just say there's label number 5 and label number 6, so I downsample it to label number 5.5. That has no meaning. So you basically would have to store a list of 5 and 6. The regions here get bigger and bigger because of like the coarser and coarser grouping in space. And so you get many, many more millions and millions and millions of objects to represent. So the typical thing to do this is storing bit arrays. So you're thinking about a gigantic bit array where every bit is set if the object is part of the set and not set if it's not part of the set. So what's shown here in blue and red, these are the nodes that are actually represented with bit arrays. They are compressed, so a lossless compression of a bit array. And all the green stuff is showing where it's switching to a probabilistic representation. So basically, we do a data adaptive hybrid that looks at which data structure is actually smaller in this case and chooses either the probabilistic one or the deterministic one to just probabilistically find out, might this object be contained in that region of space? And because you get false positives, sometimes it says, yeah, it might be contained, although it's not contained, but it never tells you it is not contained if it in fact it is. So and combining these two things, that gives a lot of benefits, both in terms of data storage and traversal speed. So all the green stuff here is basically, I mean, it's doing histograms of how many nodes are done probabilistically, which are shown in green, and how many nodes are done with two different kinds of deterministic representations. A compression that's called roaring here, because this compression method is called roaring bitmaps. And the other one is a delta compression scheme that even stores between different resolution levels the bits that change between the resolution levels. So it's like a delta compression. So an example where this is used, so this is now volume renderings of the data sets that I showed before. Basically, the user wants to do a query, and then the query has to quickly find where are all the corresponding regions in space, where are the voxels that correspond to that query. And so this is done by basically filtering the query down a tree and checking bitmaps for the query or bit arrays of the query against the bitmap. That is either the compressed version or this probabilistic hash table. The probabilistic hash table, it's called a Bloom filter. That's one probabilistic hash table that we are using here. And that's also a bitmap, but it just works in a probabilistic way. So that's like a probabilistic query that you can do on this kind of bit array. And then we did a similar thing. This is the last thing that I wanted to show today. You can also do range queries, for example, saying, okay, what part is in some range of temperature or humidity? So what is between, I don't know, 20 Fahrenheit and 50 Fahrenheit or something like this, but then you have to go find stuff where this is, right? It's really easy to do in brute force. You just have to look at all of the data cells or data voxels. But of course, to do that for terabytes or petabytes of data, this is again very tricky. So we did this probabilistic range queries, and this example for more like for meteorology data sets. to find the regions in space that contain, well, attributes that are within the range that you're looking for in a specific query. Whatever temperature, pressure, humidity, any of these kind of attribute channels. And so this is a quick illustration what this probability now does. So basically, if you do the brute force, you have to look at 100% of the data, which takes a long time. When you look at every data item, so it scales linearly, you look at all of the data set and try, is it within my range? Is it not within my range? Is it within my range? So basically, if you first do this probabilistic query against this hash table, then you get rid of all the true negatives. So the negatives that are definitely true. And then you have the remaining part. In this example, it's whatever, 33, 34% maybe. And this is what the probabilistic result gives you. And then you know that it's not only true positives, the ones that you really want, but it also has some false positives. And then you want to get rid of the false positives. But to do that, you only have to look at now 34% of this data set. And in reality, it's often much more. So to do that, you maybe have to look at 5% of the data set or 6% of the data set or something like this. In space, it would look like this. So the colored stuff is the true positive, and then you have a few outliers that were computed to be false positives that are in red. And then you either say, okay, I accept that, or you have a transfer function that actually just does not render the false positives because this mismapping all these data items to transparent, or I just fix it up by just getting rid of the false positives, but just really scanning the data that is remaining after the probabilistic query and fixing it up to a deterministic result. So you can do either of these things. Okay, so this would basically be the scanning would mean you just scan linearly now over all of the data, but it's already a subset of what you wanted to do. So let me conclude. I mean, it's like I showed you different things. So what did we do? We kind of tried to achieve scalability of volume visualization to larger and larger data sets in terms of data size, but also in terms of numbers of segmented objects, or in terms of numbers of attribute channels and different range queries that you could do, and so on. A lot of it is virtualizing the data size, like I showed in the beginning with these virtual memory hierarchies, and of course with the idea to stream in data on demand and so on. And then you could do prefetching depending on some prefetching strategy. What we did to achieve that is often decouple different tasks that need to be done by the visualization into different customized data structures. So instead of having one data structure that fits all, we have different data structures that are for customized purposes, and they are nicely combined together into a coherent algorithm for the whole thing. I didn't talk so much about GPU features, but of course, a lot of what I showed is tailored to GPU features. The main thing that I mentioned is this rasterization, for example, where you really need GPU features. You could do that in CPU rendering, but it wouldn't make any sense like this. But on GPUs, it does make a lot of sense. And also, some of these data structures are really tailored to GPUs. I also have to say, not everything that I showed you was completely done on the GPU. There's always some tasks that are maybe better on the CPU, so it's also often a hybrid between CPU computation and GPU computation, of course. But often you can move a lot of this stuff to the GPU. What you cannot move to the GPU is really loading data and so on. So at some point, the CPU needs to load data. Yeah, and then this combination of if deterministic algorithms of finding things, for example, are too slow, you can definitely also use a probabilistic approach and maybe combine the two together. So that's kind of the overarching themes that I wanted to bring together a little bit. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the talk, and thank you very much for your attention.